Hi and welcome. I'm AnewZ and you are watching Context. Baku has strongly rejected comparisons made by Russian President Vladimir Putin's aide, Vladimir Medinsky, between Karabakh and the Russia-Ukraine war. In an interview for Russia Today, Medinsky likened the conflict in Karabakh to Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, saying that if the Russia-Ukraine war was frozen along the front lines without a peace deal being made, the region would, quote, turn into a huge Karabakh, further describing Karabakh as a disputed region. The Azerbaijani foreign ministry called Medinsky's remarks inappropriate and urged him to refrain from damaging relations between the two countries. The Russian foreign ministry then came out saying Russia officially recognizes Karabakh as Azerbaijani territory. On the controversial remarks, reactions and consequences, we're talking with Taras Kuzio, professor of political sciences at the National University of Kyiv Mohila Academy, and former U.S. diplomat Matthew Bryza, coming to us from Istanbul. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. Taras, you reacted quite swiftly and in great detail to Medinsky's comparison with a comparison of your own. Can you briefly walk us through it?
Well, there is no comparison between the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and, of course, the annexation of 19% of Ukrainian territory and what took place in the First Karabakh War from 1988 to 1992. That was part of many different attempts by then the Soviet Union and then after 1991 Russia to create these kind of ethnic conflicts, to expand these conflicts, and thereby to take control of these frozen conflicts in the interests of Moscow. So what Russia did in Azerbaijan by supporting Armenia, Russia also did in Moldova with Transnistria, and in Georgia, in Abkhazia, Adjara, and in South Ossetia. This was the creation of the supporting of proxy groups, creation of separatist regions, support for kind of separatist movements. And this is what happened in the Azerbaijani case, where Soviet Union and then Russia supported Armenia in the annexation or the occupation of 20% of Azerbaijani territory right through to 2020, 2023. And this was attempted in Ukraine under Yeltsin in Crimea. It failed. Putin did the same thing in 2014. So the full-scale invasion is very different because this is Russia doing an illegal invasion and then annexing territory. The only real comparison would be in 2014, where Russia used the same kind of methods it used in Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Georgia to create this fake so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, which were fake because they were controlled by Russia. They were, again, Russian proxy kind of entities. So 2014, yes, there is a kind of a comparison because Russia was hiding its involvement, like in Georgia and Moldova. But in 2022, Russia's not hiding anything. Russia invaded with 170,000 troops, and now it has nearly 500,000 troops occupying southeastern Ukraine. So there's simply no comparison. And just finally, of course, Armenia, we tend to think in the West of Belarus as the big pro-Russian former Soviet republic, but actually Lukashenko was late to the game. Armenia already became a pro-Russian puppet state in the early 1990s in exchange for Russia helping Armenia sort of occupy 20% of Azerbaijan. Armenia became a Russian puppet state, 2 military bases. Armenia was the only Soviet country, former Soviet republic, that allowed Russian intelligence service to control its external borders. The FSB controlled those borders until about a year ago. And of course, other elements of how Russia took control of Armenia, for example, the energy sector. So Armenia was happy that Russia helped it do this kind of proxy war against Azerbaijan, and in return, Armenia lost its sovereignty and independence.
Back to the remarks that caused all this ruckus. Matthew, you were personally involved in the work of the OSCE Minsk group. How was Karabakh's status understood then by you and your colleagues? And now when you hear Medinsky saying it was a, quote, internationally disputed territory, what do you make of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, as you yourself noted, the Russian Foreign Ministry clarified today that Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. And that was always the Russian perspective, always their official opinion. And in fact, during my time as the U.S. Minsk Group co-chair, even Armenia never claimed that Karabakh was independent or was part of Armenia during our negotiations. So I interpreted Medinsky's remarks today in a different way. First of all, you have to listen carefully to what he said, right, in both Russian and the translation on RT. I think his audience was Donald Trump and Trump's administration, because what Medinsky was saying was not that Karabakh is not part of Azerbaijan. When he said it's disputed, what he meant was there was a dispute over Karabakh. I mean, that's obvious. There were two wars fought over it, even though internationally, of course, every country on earth recognized Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. So what he's trying to do is to get the attention of the Trump administration and say, look, we need me to succeed in my job right now, as assigned by President Putin, to come up with a peace agreement that is in Russia's favor, because the demands that Medinsky didn't talk about are extreme. Essentially, the demands of Russia for a peace treaty are that Ukraine effectively stops existing as an independent state and disarms itself, and that NATO rolls back its enlargement. Those are maximalist objectives that will never be acceptable to Ukraine. But what he's trying to do is frighten Trump, to have Trump put more pressure on Zelensky, like Trump did in February, by saying that if we don't get a peace treaty now, in other words, if you don't press Zelensky to say yes on our terms, then there could be another war. So the Karabakh part is just that what he says at the end is that Karabakh, it was an unrecognized entity, meaning as something not part of Azerbaijan. And if we keep Crimea or Donbass or Zaporizhia or Kherson in an ambiguous state, meaning not part of Russia, then there would be a dispute with Ukraine over these territories, and we could have a world war, a nuclear war. So he's trying to intimidate. Now, my last point is, I think Azerbaijan can use his statement to its advantage, because what he's really saying is that if the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan was not settled, as it wasn't throughout the Karabakh conflict period, that inevitably, once Armenia stopped negotiating in good faith, which it stopped doing in 2020, when Pashinyan said land for peace formula is finished, now the formula is going to be new wars for new territories. Armenia quit the negotiations, there wasn't a peace treaty, and Azerbaijan used force to restore its own territorial integrity. And in effect, that's what he is saying that Ukraine is going to do. If there's not a peace treaty now, he's saying Ukraine and NATO will eventually fight again to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, which is the fundamental right that Azerbaijan exercised. So Azerbaijan could use his misstatements, his careless statements to its advantage, I think.
Back in October of 2022, when Azerbaijan and Armenia recognized each other's territorial integrity, with Yerevan recognizing Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Karabakh, Taras, what Medinsky and some other Russian officials seem to be suggesting is that Moscow's view on Karabakh was somehow dependent on Armenia's position. Would you say that goes against Moscow's long proclaimed position that Karabakh has always belonged to Azerbaijan? And do you think this was also a message to the U.S.?
Message to the U.S. position has been already explained. I think that we have to always understand that the things that come out of the mouths of Russian officials and the Russian president are not always truthful, right? I mean, the fact that they've been saying for 30 years that they support Georgian territorial integrity, Moldovan Georgian Moldovan territorial integrity, Azerbaijan, doesn't mean anything because de facto they've been supporting these proxy groups, and this was the same in 2014 in Ukraine. Russia said it supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, whilst at the same time annexing Crimea and supporting proxy groups in the Donbass. And Armenia always voted with Russia after 2014 in support of Russia's annexation of Crimea, claiming that Crimea and Karabakh are the same. That, if Crimea has a right to so-called self-determination by joining Russia, Karabakh has also the right to self-determination. So Armenia was playing with this game all the way after 2014. Of course, Armenia had to change its position after it was defeated in 2020. But Armenia always was similar to Russia in its, I would say, revanchist and irredentist unwillingness to accept Azerbaijan both as an equal and as a country that had a right to say every former Soviet republic should inherit the territorial boundaries of the former Soviet republic. That is the basis of how the USSR collapsed. Armenia and Russia were the only two republics which rejected that position. Russia still continues to reject it, of course, because it's wanting to change borders, but Armenia was forced to accept it because of Azerbaijan's two military victories, 2020, 2023. I think a final note on Medinsky. Medinsky is also reflecting the fact that Russia is unhappy that it can no longer play Armenia and Azerbaijan off against each other. That was always Russia's position in Moldova, in Georgia, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan, that it would create conflicts, then freeze those conflicts, and then play off the participants in the conflict against each other and act like a big elder brother over them. Russia can no longer do that because Azerbaijan has resolved its territorial integrity issue with Armenia. It's thrown out the occupation, as it were. So I think Medinsky's position is also a reflection of that he's a bit nostalgic for the fact of the good old days when Russia could play this game with the former Soviet republics. It can no longer do that in the South Caucasus, except in Georgia, of course.
Matthew, one of the words that you used to describe the remarks by Medinsky was, if I'm not mistaken, careless, by saying that it's a message to the US. But what do such comments do to Russia's diplomatic standing in its immediate region, apart from Ukraine, of course?
Well, in this case, I mean, obviously, this careless remark caused damage to Azerbaijan's relationship with Russia, and that's why the Russian Foreign Ministry came out to clarify that it does, of course, recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, including Karabakh. So I think at the end of the day, based on my interpretation, I don't think that his careless remarks are going to have much of an impact locally. As Taras was explaining, Russia tries to play its games dividing and conquering, and always has in the South Caucasus. I remember one case when we were generating real momentum in the Minsk group process. I was there with my Russian counterpart, also my French counterpart, and we were getting on a helicopter to fly from Khojali to Yerevan, and there was one of the classic, I won't say his name, but one of the classic Russian parliamentarians who sows the sort of discord that Taras was describing. And I looked at him and I said, what the heck are you doing on this helicopter? We're here trying to finalize an agreement. And he sort of laughed, looked down, he says, I'm playing my normal game. So this has always been, that's the legacy of Russian diplomacy in the South Caucasus, as well as in Transnistria, Moldova. And it's not so much this one careless remark, which, again, I think was intended not to undermine Azerbaijan's territorial integrity or Russia's commitment to it, but to make a point that Ukraine better reach this peace agreement on Russia's terms, or else Ukraine is going to provoke a wider pan-European and maybe intercontinental war.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and providing your insights and opinions. And thank you for watching. That's all that we had for you in this edition of Context. Do stay tuned to AnewZ.